I have to be honest. At first, I was skeptical of positive psychology, and now here I am, 20 years later. Honestly, both empirically and personally and conceptually, drifting in that direction. So back to the original query, which is, um, is psychiatry intrinsically limited? And I think my provisional response is yeah, to a degree, because psychiatry was derived from a medical model, which does tend to, as a default assumption, see everything as a direct manifestation of neuroanatomical or biochemical activity. And therefore, the first impulse vis-a-vis intervention will tend to be pharmacological. And this is not always the case. I know of quite a few psychiatrists that are just as devoted to other kinds of interventions, but the kind of standard approach to psychiatry is still pretty much anchored to a medical model. And so I think that's one limitation. Another possibility. So Otto Rank, who was one of Freud's disciples in the Denial of Death, Becker quotes Rank, and I'm going to botch it, but Rank said something like, "Psychology is a preponderantly negative and disintegrating ideology." And so here's Otto Rank, a great therapist, and I think this is in his book Beyond Psychology, where he's like, I've spent 40 years thinking about living. Now I'm just going to live. But Ronk's point is that psychiatry, as well as clinical psychology, is ultimately, I don't know what I was going to say flawed, but how about limited? Because the way that Ronk put it and the way that Becker describes it, you go in and you see a psychiatrist or you see a psychologist. They do some psychological archaeology and come up with an explanation of why you are dissatisfied with yourself, and then they essentially leave you to with no way then to do much with that. In other words, they're like, here you are, you're a non-optimal self. I can explain to you perhaps the nature of your misery or even the history of its origin, but that in no way offers any insights about what to do thereafter. And so that's just, and even Freud at one point said, psychoanalysis can cure you of the misery of neurosis so you can come face to face with the misery of life. Oh, that was uplifting. And so that's another possible way of seeing psychiatry as being a bit limited. And then what I would say, my preoccupation these days, well, there's two other things. One is that, and here's where I'm influenced very much by on the floor in the building that I'm in. The psych department's on the first floor, and I got moved up because we didn't have enough offices. But I hang out now amongst the historians and the social workers, and what they have pointed out, and what I was aware of, but not sufficiently, is just the extent to which really big institutional structures have, an extraordinarily potent effect on psychological matters. And psychiatry, in an effort to appear objective, masquerades as apolitical, ahistorical, having nothing to do with social structures. And my point is, you're being political when you say you're apolitical. You're being historical when you say that you're ahistorical. And to me, I think that's another important consideration that we need to ponder. My first little academic rant was titled "Why America Causes Mental Illness." I don't know why it didn't go over that well. But but my point is that I don't think we are psychodynamically sufficiently aware of how institutions impact our interior mental lives, and we could do better on that. But then back to the positive psychology folks who, following Aristotle, have argued again. At first, I thought they were just kind of Woodstock like hippies, overly naive and positive, and many of those folks are. But this is not the time to engage at that level. I mean, I was invited to the first positive psychology conference by Martin Seligman and Chicks Make Me High, the Flow dude. And then I was never invited again because they're like, you're a downer. Stop talking about death. This is positive psychology. But the point, though, is that, Aristotle, he was adamant that, to live a good life, they call it flourishing these days, is more than just the absence of negative symptoms. And what the positive psychologists have done now empirically is to demonstrate that fact, and that well-being is more than just the absence of symptoms. I think the way that most folks think about flourishing these days, and it really does map on to Aristotle's. He's sitting on a rock 3,000 years ago with a chunk of feta cheese, and he's thinking about stuff that today strikes me as quite accurate. He's like, well, a flourishing individual has a sense of meaning and purpose, has a sense of self-efficacy, has a sense of moral virtue. Aristotle also talked about practical wisdom, and talked about the fact that it's impossible to flourish as an isolated individual in the absence of social relationships characterized by trust and respect. And yeah, and so I think that there's lots of directions that psychiatry and clinical psychology can be moving in. And the good news is that they are. And so I'm working with some awesome folks, and we just did a study looking at a big data set, like 80,000 individuals, and it was looking at the relationship between a flourishing measure and suicidal ideology and behavior and self-harm. And sure enough, what we found, was that there was a strong negative correlation between flourishing and suicidal behavior, ideology, and self-harm. In other words, the higher the self-reported flourishing, the lower were all these negative outcomes. And that was after controlling for all of the negative symptoms like depression and loneliness. And so I would say on empirical grounds that we now know that there's something to strive for above and beyond the eradication of particular symptoms. Well, but that we also know, and you've probably seen this, the amazing research with psychedelics. I'm like an ancient hippie, so it's easy to dismiss my view as one too many Grateful Dead shows in my youth. But the point is that the hippie days set us back 50 years, because before the 1960s, there was a massive literature from Europe suggesting that under certain conditions that experiences with psychedelics could have the same effect as long-term meditation actually has the same effect as near-death experiences without having to nearly die. And I think this all bodes well. I think we're at a moment where, in part, I think, as a result of empirical work in existential domains, it just doesn't sound quite as maniacally speculative, but to think in these terms that there are a variety of ways to infuse our lives with meaning and value, and in so doing, allow us to manage death anxiety in a fashion that doesn't necessarily have deleterious consequences. And I think that's a fine goal aspirationally.
Absolutely. It's very tricky to talk about because you're always fearful that people might take these things dogmatically, right? That you mentioned psychedelics. Well, there are instances where you actually do need traditional psychiatry and pharmacology. And there are
Absolutely.
instances where you do need to stay away from psychedelics. So
Absolutely.
I'm always fearful that people are listening to the nuances of these.
Yes, so absolutely. So let's say this again, because this is none of these statements, or actually to back up, like in psychobabble, the point is whenever we make a declarative statement like, oh, psychedelics have been shown to be beneficial, the immediate question should be for whom and under what conditions. And I think you make a fine point. And our view these days is, trying to be pragmatic and eclectic. Yeah, psychedelics for one person, it might be meditation for another. It might be telling stories. There's a great literature now about how extraordinarily palliative and uplifting it is to just being asked to tell one's life story in the company of somebody who is interested in listening. And yeah, I think right now, to get back to an earlier point, where there is a degree of psychological need that is such that it would be silly to confine our inquiry to a single approach and assume that it's going to work for all folks at all times. It's a great point.
Do you think clinical approaches psychiatry inherently function on a dysfunction model in that in order to apply psychotherapy or psychiatry, you need to imagine that there's something wrong with the person, some sort of damage in them, and then the reason I ask this, where I'm going with this is, well, if we're to take Becker's claim seriously, that death anxiety isn't something wrong, it isn't some sort of anatomical or physiological damage in the person, it is inherently a part of what it means to be human, then does that pose a problem for a dysfunction model of psychiatry?
Yeah, I think it poses a challenge to take a closer look. This is awesome. I wish I was young. I mean, I'm being silly because what I say now is, um, well, what I say is that if you're just starting college now, and if you want to do this work, you need 3 PhDs. You got to have cognitive neuroscience. You got to have another one in kind of philosophy, broadly defined as back in the old days when psychology, sociology, philosophy were more unified. Yeah, and then you need a PhD in like statistics and methods for the 21st century. And the reason I'm mentioning all these things is that I'm seeing work now all over the world. There's some scholars in Asia, and this is to my discredit. I've reviewed papers, and I don't know necessarily the author's name. There's some other work from Israeli researchers, and they're looking at the effects of death reminders on literally individual neurons at this point. And they are claiming to be at the point of having a neurological model of what happens as we begin to come to terms with death. Because the goal is not to eliminate death anxiety. That's not possible, nor would it be desirable. That's my silly joke. If you were a baby, and your mom and dad were out at a concert and they forgot about you for a couple of days, and you were not worried about anything, well, you would be dead. In other words, we need anxiety, or at least a bit of it, to be alive. And so when Albert Camus says, come to terms with death, thereafter, anything is possible. Well, the one thing he's not saying is possible is that death anxiety will be obliterated. Rather, what we can hope for is that it's not constantly buried under the psychological bushes, where it comes back allegorically to bear bitter fruit. It just ultimately comes down to what happens when we stop repressing death anxiety. And yes, at that point, where I see the neuroscientists and the psychiatrists going, it is we think that there are ways of looking at what happens as people are coming to terms with death. And that allows for the expansion, I think, of psychiatric discourse to go beyond the mitigation of dysfunction, as opposed to the alteration of basic processes to render them such that psychodynamically and emotionally and intuitively we are more comfortable with the reality of the human condition.